In the previous lessons, we had been talking about the captains of industry or robber barons, the business people. And the essential question was asking to compare the strategies and tactics of the captains of industry with the laboring class. So here's what we're going to talk about: the labor class or the labor unions. And that is, we're talking about the working class. During the Gilded Age, the working class was facing dangerous conditions, long hours, low pay. Children and women are both working. Both of them receive lower pay. The reason for that, in addition to the lower pay, they're more easy to physically control. So the workers are going to try to come together and organize themselves so that they can have a counterbalance to the power of the captains of industry, the robber barons. Well, one of the things that the working class realized was if they worked together, they could organize into unions, and then they could threaten the owners with a strike if they didn't attempt to negotiate with them. Now, striking was a last case scenario. They did not want to strike. If they could afford to strike, which means they don't get paid, they wouldn't have to go on strike. But they could threaten that strike, which means that they would surround the building and make sure nobody came in to work the machines and do the work of the working class until their demands were met. And what they typically wanted were the holy trinity of improved conditions, better pay, and better conditions. Now, those members those people that did join unions or threatened to strike often faced blacklisting, which means their names were put down on a list and they were not allowed to work anymore. That name would be passed around and nobody would hire them. But the goal of better hours and conditions and better conditions and better wages were so important that they took that risk. Owners would try to break the strikes by hiring scabs. And a scab was somebody that it's a derogatory term for people that would come in and try to work the machines that weren't part of the union. And the scabs would they would attempt to break the strike through that. Typically, these are unskilled workers. Typically, they are going to be people that were deemed as inferior, minority populations, immigrants, sometimes women, as a way to retaliate against the workers themselves. One of the more famous union strikes was the railroad strike of 1877, caused by a reduction in wages, even though the railroads were making plenty of money. The workers were facing this wage reduction, and the working conditions were pretty poor. And because the railroad strike closed down most traffic throughout the northern part of the United States, police were called in to try to break the strike, and eventually the National Guard was called in to fight against the protesters. And in the end, the federal troops, and you can see in this picture here, federal troops were sent to support the owners and were used against the working class to try to break the strike. Rutherford Hayes argued that the mail was going to be on the railroads, so therefore the mail, which is in the Constitution as a guaranteed right, needed to be delivered. So therefore, the strike needed to be broken so that they could deliver the mail. But the bigger issue here, though, is the federal government being used against the working class. Still, workers decided to join together, and they did try to unite. And one of the more popular early unions was called the Knights of Labor. They're largely successful. They were made up of skilled and unskilled workers. They were fighting for better wages, better conditions, and an 8-hour workday. The thing that limited the Knights of Labor was that it was had unskilled labor in the member ranks. Unskilled labor is easier to replace than skilled labor, so owners were able to scab them out a little bit more easily. One of the tactics the captains of industry used against unions was to call them anarchists, socialists, and just generally un-American, right? To be American was to be pro-capitalism, and the owners said that they were capitalist and the workers that united together were violating their rights to make money. So unions are going to be labeled by the employers as anarchists, which are anti-government. Bolsheviks here you can see in this picture, which would have been a communist, which is similar to socialist, where they want the government to control everything. So an anarchist wants no government. Bolsheviks and communists want all government controlling business. Socialism is kind of in the middle somewhere, but it didn't matter because the slur was being used to try to paint unions and workers as just generally un-American. In 1886, so this is 9 years after the railroad strike, a union was meeting in Chicago at a place called the Haymarket. And at the Haymarket, the union is having a meeting, and the union, the more and more people were showing up at the Haymarket Square. And as more people are showing up, police officers started to surround the Haymarket, and a bomb goes off during the Haymarket Square meeting that killed 8 police officers at this rally. No union members were found guilty of the bomb going off, but the backlash to this is going to be used against unions. Union members were there, so therefore, and police were attacked, so therefore, it must have been the union that had caused this attack, and it set the union movement back a bit. The most successful of the unions was the American Federation of Labor, and this is 1886. This is right around the same time as the Haymarket Square riots. And the American Federation of Labor was successful because it only allowed for skilled workers in its union, which means it was harder for the captains of industry, the robber barons, to replace them with scab labor. The thing that the American Federation also did was try not to strike. They preferred to use collective bargaining. And collective bargaining just means that the owners sit on one side of the table, the workers sit on the other side of the table, and they come to an agreement as to what the hours, wages, working conditions, and anything else that needed to be negotiated. Owners and workers would negotiate together in this collective bargaining arrangement. Most of the major sports organizations we have today have some sort of a collective bargaining agreement. You have owners of the baseball team, the baseball players themselves, they meet together and they come up with the rules for how contracts need to be negotiated, the number of days, what types of testing there is. All that stuff is a result of collective bargaining. Again, the American Federation of Labor is more successful, but that's because they weren't helping unskilled labor. An example of the unskilled labor facing difficult times was the Homestead Steel Strike. Now, this is 1892, so another 6 years after the Haymarket Square riot and the American Federation of Labor we just talked about. Government is going to be used to break the labor union again here in Homestead, Pennsylvania. Andrew Carnegie had a steel plant in Pennsylvania. Now, we talked about Carnegie, and he wanted to be seen as a captain of industry, and he had his whole gospel of wealth where he was trying to say that he knew better than the poor people, so therefore he should be rich so that he could take care of the poor. But he also did bend the rules of the system to make sure that he would be successful and they wouldn't. For example, in Homestead, Pennsylvania, the workers were facing a pay cut. The sale of steel wasn't really going down, and the workers wanted to have a raise. Carnegie, through his representative, I think his name is Howard Frick, decided to cut pay instead of giving them a raise. And the workers went on strike. Now you can see here, there's women here in this picture as well. The women were on the striking lines with their husbands, and the owner, Carnegie, and his representative Frick sent in a group of armed thugs called the Pinkertons to attack the striking workers. The workers fight back. There's a couple of deaths on either side. The Pennsylvania then sends in the National Guard, which ended the strike in favor of ownership. So again, government being used against the working class. Same thing happens in 1894, 2 years after the Homestead Steel Strike. This is called the Pullman Strike, and wages, again, on the railroad were cut by another 25%. leads to a national railroad strike. The ownership got a federal injunction, which is just a legal term that says they had to go back to work. The strike had to end. And federal troops were again used against striking workers. This is a pattern we're going to see over and over and over in the Gilded Age, where the government supports the ownership at the at the harm of the working class, and then we're not going to see that change until Teddy Roosevelt in 1900. Take a moment, pause, highlight every instance where the working class was attempting to improve their lives.